Hi, I'm Philip Samartzis. I'm a sound artist and curator with a specific interest in field recording and sound art. And so, what is sound art? Sound art is an extension, I guess, of avant-garde musical practices, looking at other ways of creating sound experiences beyond musical or instrumental articulation. One of the joys of working as a sound artist is that it's a transdisciplinary process. I can work with musicians and composers, as I have done with Speak Percussion, which is an extraordinary experience and an opportunity to have. I can also work with visual artists, photographers, filmmakers. I also work with architects as well. So I tend to kind of privilege collaboration because it allows me to produce something that I don't completely control. It again speaks to that idea of post-studio practice, working in the field where you're not necessarily controlling many of the elements. You're being responsive to it, and therefore you need to be adaptive and deploy ideas around improvisation in some respects in order to capture some of the events, some of the material that you're interested in registering whilst on location. So collaboration is an extraordinary opportunity. I know musicians naturally are convivial and social and play together and create beautiful outcomes as a collective enterprise. Not that common in the fine art world, which I operate in mainly, and therefore you have the soul artist in the atelier painting some kind of landscape that bears their soul and their experiences as a traumatized child, for example. You know, they tend to be a solitary kind of lot. However, I like to be social, and therefore I work collaboratively, and one of the outcomes that I produce from my fieldwork in Antarctica is titled Polar Force, a collaboration with Speak Percussion. I find it a really fascinating project because when I went to Antarctica in 2016, my intention was to record the environment as if I was recording Speak Percussion. And therefore I used multiple microphones in real time on location to capture the stresses and the velocity and the fatigue of the built environment as it's being exposed to I guess, high velocity wind, in this instance katabatic wind, and that's the type of wind that commences in the South Pole and gains force as it reaches the coast. And so they're the cause of a lot of the blizzards and the challenging weather that one encounters whilst on the ice. And so I recorded a lot of sounds with the idea that rather than thinking of them as buildings or infrastructure, I was thinking of them as performers and applying different microphones and microphone technique to capture the best representation of the sounds that they were emitting at any given time. Whilst I was on location, we did encounter the strongest blizzard ever recorded at Casey Station in summer, and this was 2016. So they do have stronger blizzards in winter, but in summer, this one was recorded at around about 190 kilometres an hour, lasted 36 hours, and as I mentioned, it's the strongest blizzard ever registered at Casey at that time, and it's an equivalent to the cyclone that flattened Darwin back in the mid-70s, if you might recall that through historical documentation. So a very powerful weather event. And during that 36 hours, I had my 16 microphones and multiple recorders all kind of underway, thinking of Speak Percussion kind of hammering away at their instruments, and as the station was howling in rage. And so Polar Force emerges from that initial fieldwork. I presented the recordings to excuse me, Eugene Ugeti, and with the idea that he would design some form of instrumental response to the fieldwork that I'd done. And my intention ultimately was to remove the fieldwork, the sounds that I'd recorded in Antarctica, and have it entirely replaced by the ensemble, and allow the instruments and different instrumental technique and different forms of instrumentation to kind of mimic the sound of Antarctica as a modern composition in the way that I'm hearing it on location through its sounds. So I love that idea of ambiguity and play, that what you're hearing is not discernible in terms of its source or origin. Is it instrumental? Is it environmental? Is it a combination of both? So that's one of the fundamental compositional premises of the work, is that what you're hearing isn't necessarily aligned to any particular source of sound, whether it's instrumental or whether it's environmental. We also presented the work in an inflatable environment that resembles somewhat the remote research stations one finds in Antarctica. Antarctica has a main base. Well, in the Australian Antarctic Territory there are 3 of them, but generally you have one main base station, and then you have multiple kind of field huts scattered around the station for deep science, and that might be related to studying penguins and seals, or it might be for climate research or ice core drilling, that kind of thing. So they're kind of prefabricated buildings that are located more or less in and around the vicinity of station. Allows you to operate in a safe space in quite an extreme wilderness environment. And we took our architectural cues from those field huts and performed the work within this particular environment. So it becomes the fabric, it becomes the context for the performance to operate within. So again, collaboration is really important in terms of not only the compositional process, the articulation through performance, there's also the element of instrument design that informs the work, in which new instruments were built to channel ice and water into musical form that was somehow controllable by the performers within the work. There's obviously the architectural space that I just spoke to as well, that somehow has some kind of correlation to what one might find in Antarctica, and then elements such as light as well. So it creates a highly theatrical dramaturgy, if you will, for the work itself. And so context is really an important aspect of any presentation. As composers and musicians, I'm sure you're used to working in particular environments, whether it's a concert venue of some description, something maybe more modest in terms of a local kind of pub scenario, or anywhere in between. So for me, context is incredibly important because it shapes the listening, shapes the encounter, shapes the experience of a work itself, the way something looks, the way it smells, the way it feels, how I use my body as an audience. Am I sitting down? Am I standing up? Am I uncomfortable? Am I comfortable? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it, back in the day when I was going to lots of concerts, is it smoky or not? Can I smell beer or not? So these are all sensorial things that are incredibly important to me, and I try and bring in as much of those elements, as I can through my projects. So I often find myself working with architects, creating kind of listening environments for the works that I produce. And that's an incredibly rich and powerful form of collaboration that I have. And I often describe what I want to do as a site of discomfort. And this is often at odds with what architects are used to doing. Architects are used to building environments that are comfortable, that bring in some kind of social dimension to a certain place or set of conditions. But I want the opposite. I want audiences to be very uncomfortable in the way that I'm uncomfortable when working in the field. I'm cold, I'm miserable, I'm alone, I'm frightened for my life, being exposed to extreme environments and conditions, all kinds of things, all kinds of anxieties are feeding my mind and my body as I'm making the recordings. And so they're not passive, they're ingrained with all these emotions that I'm feeling. And I want audiences to hear them in the same way. I don't want them to sit down in a bean chair and lose themselves in a blizzard. I want them to feel the blizzard. I want them to be uncomfortable and somewhat frightened by the experience. And you can do that through volume, of course, and spatial choreography. You can do that through architecture and materiality as well. And that's something that's very cognizant in my practice, in the sense that I'm always thinking as to how to best articulate these experiences. Now I'm giving you extreme examples of that. Doesn't have to be as extreme as that, but modes of dissemination and collaboration are an integral part of what I do, because it allows me to complicate the things that I do. I have a skill set that I know I have, and I know I'm able to achieve certain outcomes with it, but it's more about what other people can bring to the conversation that extends the work beyond what I can do into something much more complicated, much richer, and I think ultimately far more engaging for audiences. So in conclusion, some of the things that we have covered during these series of talks have been ideas of all sound being musical, and that composition is really a process of perception. I think that's one important point. Post-studio practice of working outside of your normal set of constraints, whether technological, architectural, material, and pushing yourself into different spaces can yield really quite surprising outcomes is another important element of my presentation. Socially engaged practices, being responsive to the needs of different communities, working collaboratively with them to come out with a different set of outcomes that you don't necessarily own or control, that is more reflective of a community's set of concerns, I think is a wonderful and beautiful opportunity for artists to consider regardless of your practice. Working collaboratively in modes of presentation as well, I think is a wonderful way of extending what you do, bringing in different disciplines, different ideas, different modes of engagement and knowledge to extrapolate and extend what you do as an artist, which I think ultimately will bring a broader not only perspective but a deeper engagement for audiences into your own personal practice.